Good evening and thank you for joining us. Too many drunks. 3 words that basically sum up the independent review of the Stanley Cup riots. The review, at a cost of $313,000, was done by former Vancouver Olympic Committee head John Furlong and Doug Keefe, a former Deputy Justice Minister in Nova Scotia. And while the two conclude that police and civic officials made some mistakes, they are unwilling to blame anyone other than the rioters. The crowd was larger, they said, and arrived much earlier than city or police officials ever anticipated, and security efforts were simply overwhelmed. More on the report and the recommendations now from Ted Field.
Millions in property damage and a huge blow to Vancouver's international reputation. The Stanley Cup riot report is out, and John Furlong fixes the blame on the thugs.
The riot was caused by thugs and villains and people who cheered them on. And it was left to everybody else to try to manage and bring that evening to the safest conclusion they possibly could. It is our opinion, and we've stated it in the report, that a huge factor in what happened that day was alcohol. And there was free-flowing alcohol pretty well all day, and it had an enormous impact on the atmosphere and the attitude and the behavior of people from fairly early on and right to the end of the day.
The report finally discloses what many have wanted to know. The number of on-duty officers started at 446 and reached 928 at full riot deployment. They were trying to manage a crowd conservatively estimated at 155,000.
There were not too few police, there were too many people. Not too many people for the police, but too many people for the venue.
The report finds rioters and alcohol were to blame. Police in the city were unprepared for the massive crowd. Mayor Robertson played no role in event planning. The review feels the number of police in the original plan was appropriate. There were communication and planning problems with police.
There are too many people. They are too drunk. Alcohol sales that day were 68% higher than they were the year previously on the same Wednesday.
The report recommends a limit to alcohol sales across the region, the creation of a regional tactical police squad, a special court to deal with riot suspects, and the riot should not stop future large public events. While the report lays blame on thugs, it's also highly critical of the thousands of people who stayed downtown, watched and took pictures, creating an audience on a night when the city became a stadium.
For his part, the Vancouver Chief of Police says he's satisfied with the review and he's pleased to see that the police response was praised as heroic despite some mistakes. He also says that the force will be looking at all of the recommendations with a view to implementation. More on what the review says about the VPD and reaction to it from John Daly.
There were 446 police on hand at the start of the game, but signs of trouble were obvious as early as 1 p.m.
Where we think people didn't do a very good job is there wasn't any early warning triggers in their plan. We have specific comments on that they should have had one of the helicopters in the air. They should have had the police who were early deployed calling back in and saying, we've got to rev up our deployment.
More than 80% of the Vancouver police who actually worked the riot, when surveyed, said there were not enough officers.
If I had infinite amounts of money, I would deploy officers 5 hours before when I think they're needed, just to be on the safe side. But we don't do that. We have to be responsible with public money. We'll deploy the officers when we think they're needed. As it turned out, the crowd arrived early, much, much earlier than we thought they would arrive. And so to deploy officers quickly in that situation is difficult. Officers are driving to work. It's not like they're sitting on a shelf somewhere and we can just roll them out on the street.
In addition to a much bigger crowd and police losing control before the game even started, the report found riot gear was stored too far from problem areas, and some police radios and loudhailers didn't work.
Running out of tear gas, insufficient tear gas, yes. Some units coming in without gas masks all the way from Abbotsford, so they couldn't be deployed. There were police officers coming in to try and help out, but didn't have radio equipment and so on and so forth. It's a really sad litany of errors.
And when these cops had to run for the riot gear at 8 p.m., precious time and crowd control was lost.
It may have taken up to, in some cases, 40 minutes for them from when the order was given to get on their tactical gear because of the congestion and because of where the gear was cached.
By the end of the riot, there were 928 Vancouver, RCMP, and various other brands of cops on hand. The report recommends the VPD and RCMP riot squads train together, but stops short of recommending a regional or provincial police force.
Certainly in terms of police deployment, all of those problems would not have occurred had there been a regional police service.
Now, although the review does seem to let the Vancouver mayor off quite easily, it does criticize the lack of planning for such a huge event. The implication being, if the mayor is going to invite big crowds to outdoor venues, there should be a lot more care put into ensuring the safety of those crowds. We get more on the political aspect of the riot review now from Darlene Heidemann.
When it comes to the politicians, today's report finds they could have done far better. It reveals that City Hall underestimated how big the crowds would get on June 15th, that they were complacent after the success of the Olympics, and most of all, they didn't have a plan.
Well, the city did have a plan in this case, and as the report lays out, there certainly is room for improvement, but there were many learnings and many actions taken since '94 to deal with an event like this.
The report has countless excerpts that reveal what happened behind the scenes. It says the VPD expressed concerns to the city that Granville Street was too narrow for a live site. Still, it went ahead. That the police asked for more security guards to help with liquor pour-outs, but those concerns were ignored. And on riot day, the city's emergency operations center was at level 1 for small crowds and didn't get raised to level 2 until it was too late. While trouble was brewing, the mayor was not at the center, but at Rogers Arena watching the game. And though the report claims the city did not put political pressure on police, it also says cost effectiveness was important.
There was no political interference whatsoever in all of this, so it was very, very clear lines of authority, very clear in terms of the budgets and the dollars that were requested, and those were forwarded by the city and by the province.
The piece that jumps out of me is the complete irresponsibility of Gregor Robertson. As you know, this was run out of his office. Now we learn he paid no attention to details. He's never taken responsibilities. He's never said, the buck stops at my desk.
The report also finds that the province and Solicitor General's office could have done more by offering a regional safety plan and regional funding for policing that night, and it should have shut down liquor stores earlier. Quite blankly, it says without the alcohol, there may not have been a riot. It's recommending a long list of new legislation, including new fines for open liquor consumption, more powers for transit police to deal with open liquor, and more powers for the Liquor Control Board.
I have already asked the Liquor Control Board to contemplate the recommendations around search and seizure. We need to work closely with the Attorney General's staff.
And it's a big, thorough report. So we'll be looking into all the recommendations that are there.
And it doesn't let Rogers Arena or the Canucks franchise off the hook either, saying from now on they should have to pay more towards policing such outdoor events.
And finally tonight, the business response. As you know, a number of stores in the area of Georgia and Richard Streets were badly damaged and looted by the rioters. And tonight, the people who work in those stores say they generally agree with the review's conclusion that more planning was needed to ensure public safety. But the Downtown Business Association takes it one step further, calling for more surveillance cameras to be installed in some key locations.
While looters smashed windows and trashed the Gigino restaurant, the owner's family was cowering in the back, terrified.
Almost like a zombie movie, because there were so many of them. And it's kind of like one would break something, they would run, and you're like, okay, now they're gone. But another group would come, or another set, you know, and it just kept coming and coming. And
the emotional scars have healed, says Francesco Caligueri, and he's hoping the report may prevent another riot.
I hope that this time around the report will be read and will be used next time, as it wasn't used on 94.
The Blends coffee shop was also targeted by rioters who destroyed everything inside.
It's taken 2.5 months to rebuild, and Blends just reopened August 19th. The owner, who didn't want to go on camera, said she agrees with the report that a lot more planning should have happened.
So many businesses lost everything, including Black and Lee tuxedos, where looters even stole the mannequins. And every owner we talked to was frustrated by the fact that no one has been charged yet.
You talk at all about prosecutions? Do you feel that's going fast enough?
No. Look at London, 3 days of rioting and 100 people charged.
In fact, many downtown businesses support the idea of having a closed-circuit TV surveillance system similar to London's, which helped police there lay charges quickly.
Items such as CCTVs, possibly having that as part of the package of doing major events. We'd like to see a public discourse on that so that there can be a discussion on protocols, when would the cameras be used, under what circumstances, and I think the public should be involved in that discussion.
Still, some businesses told us they never want to see an event this large in the downtown core again, no matter how much planning there is.
Well, we've already heard from those who feel that despite what the report says, that Vancouver Mayor Gregor Robertson is at least partly responsible for the breakdown in law and order that day. And Mayor Robertson joins us now live from City Hall to discuss the report. Thanks very much for joining us, Mayor. We're glad to have you with us. And let me start by asking, do you regret being so removed from the planning process for Game 7?
Well, I think what's critical here is that we needed a regional planning process, given that so many people came from outside of the city of Vancouver into the downtown. We needed a much broader approach. That's what the recommendations really focus on. So there was a plan in place. The city had a plan. The VPD had a plan. But clearly there were so many people coming downtown. They came early, and many of them came with alcohol on board, and that created a lot more problems than anyone could have anticipated, despite the learnings from the '94 riot.
On the topic of the VPD, Mayor, Chief Jim Chu seemed to make the point that if he had more money, he would have put more police on the ground there. Did he come to you with the budget? Was it the city pressuring him to keep costs down? Who's ultimately responsible for the amount of money that you decided was to be spent that night?
The chief put forward a plan to police the event, and the budget attached to that was approved by City Council. All the resources that were requested were respected. So there was, as the report says, there was absolutely no political interference in the budget process or the operational planning. We don't get involved in that directly in any way. So what changed was the fact that there was a plan in place, but factors did shift. People came early, people came drinking heavily, and people came ready to incite a riot, and that had not been anticipated. There was no intelligence that indicated that. So it put the police in a very difficult situation, and there's a lot of lessons to learn from this, obviously. There are excellent recommendations that certainly I'm committed as mayor to implementing the city's actions from those recommendations.
We know there's a city report that was released just after this one was released, Mayor, that basically states that the playoffs and the riot cost the city, Vancouver taxpayers, about $2 million. Who should foot that bill next year? Who do you think should pay for these kinds of city celebrations, whatever mop-up needs to happen afterwards?
Well, it's a very good question, and the Mr. Furlong and Mr. Keefe's report was clear that we needed to be designating events of this magnitude as regional events and have more support and more integration of the partners around the region and with the province as well, and ensuring the transportation and the alcohol and those key factors are being managed proactively. So I think in terms of costs and planning, we need to all be looking at this together, around a table together, to ensure that we're making the right planning steps and we're ensuring that the resources there are from around the region and the province to have everything in place.
Fast forward 6 months, because the Canucks look strong again this year, and nobody would be surprised if they made it back to the Stanley Cup Final. Are you going to be able to get those kinds of recommendations in place, that planning structure in place, in time to have an impact next year?
Definitely. There actually have been a number of steps taken by the police department and by the city, which we implemented going into the celebration of lights, and which will again tune up for the Grey Cup celebrations in a few months. So we're stepping this up, learning from the recommendations. Obviously, for the next playoffs, I hope to see a more proactive role from the Canucks and the NHL in particular, which is typical of other leagues, other professional international sports. So we'd like to see all of this in place before the next Stanley Cup playoffs, because I think we all hope the Canucks are there, and this time we win it.
And they contributed nothing this year, is that correct?
No, their focus was on Rogers Arena, and they did open the arena for the away games, so they took some steps, and they're involved in the policing side of that internally, but not in terms of the streets. And what we saw were so many people coming downtown, and that's what we've seen repeatedly from the Olympics to the playoffs. People come downtown and they want to celebrate, so it's incumbent upon us to create the right conditions, to have the right activities for people to do things, and those are recommendations from '94. I think they're reinforced by what happened on June 15th, and now we have work to do to implement new recommendations for the next.
Most people agree. Thanks very much, Mayor. We appreciate your time tonight.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, Mayor Gregor Robertson with us tonight from City Hall.